During the height of the Iraqi-Iranian War, a family residing in Tehran began to experience horrors beyond warfare. As a dark entity haunts the mother and her daughter, what must they do to lessen the troubles haunting them?
Hello, and welcome to our channel. So today we'll recap and review a British foreign language drama fantasy and horror film released in 2016 called Under the Shadow. Let's jump right in.
Shida, an aspiring med student, is recalled by her university's dean after she was investigated for leftist political activism during the Iranian Revolution. Arguing that the political activism was the norm then, the dean shuts her down for being active on the wrong side. His wrong side. The dean has no choice but to terminate her scholarship and any chances she could have in her pursuit of medicine ever again. Arriving at her apartment, disappointed by her circumstances, she is greeted by Mrs. Fakir, a tenant tending to Shida's adorable daughter, Dorsa. After being consoled, the former med student then grabs hold of her prized heirloom, a book of psychology signed by her deceased mother. Later on, her husband, Iraj, returns home as well, much to Dorsa's welcome. Iraj is a doctor himself, so it seems that Shida's pursuit of medicine may be inspired by her husband's current profession, though it's actually what her late mother intended for her as her dream, only for her mother's dying wish to be shunned by the very customs she has no choice but to abide by. Not only has her customs and practices, but her husband as well, who see good out of Shida's expulsion from the university. For this, Shida resents Iraj for insulting her dreams. Suddenly, a bombing raid occurs. Lights abruptly go out while air raid sirens simultaneously bleat in the background. Everybody in the apartment descends for the basement to seek cover, but Dorsa lags herself and Iraj behind as she picks up Kamiya, her doll, while the rest of the tenants cower, discussing rumors about Iraq readying to launch missiles towards the Iranian capital. A young boy hands Dorsa a trinket she later loses. The young boy, Mehdi, lost his parents in the war and is now residing with his relatives, who happen to be the owners of the apartment complex, the Ibrahimis. After things cool down, Dorsa is still disturbed, but not by the imminent threat of a bombardment. Disrupting her father's sleep, the next morning, Iraj assesses the issue of his daughter's night terrors while reassuring her that Kamiya is there to accompany the little girl in her sleep, taking Dorsa's fear of the night, at least for now. Shida then insists that her daughter's nightmares are just that, nightmares, which hints towards her skepticism of the supernatural as she discards Dorsa's concerns as merely imagined. Their breakfast talk then veers into the subject of Iraj's annual draft notice. Being a physician, his expertise is required in the breach, so he couldn't bear to tell his family anytime sooner to not worry them, which happens to worry them more. Stressed out from the news, Shida brings out her exercise tape to blow off steam. Tehran is close to becoming a battlefield, so Iraj prompts Shida that she takes Dorsa and seek refuge at his parents, far from conflict. Refusing his offer as she's too hesitant to deal with his side of the family, Shida also asserts Tehran is far from danger while also taking Iraj's offer as another insult, this time her being as a mother, claiming that her moving away would be the admittance of her incapability of raising their child. Iraj argues that he simply won't be around for them if things go south, going as to how he could lose his license to practice medicine if he dodges the draft, insulting his wife, even more, reflecting her loss of acquiring a license of her own. Quarreling set aside, Iraj then tapes over their apartment windows one last time as he bids his wife and daughter goodbye. Night falls, and being the only parent present, Shida is awakened by Dorsa calling for her. Heading towards her room, she finds that the girl has wet her bed, uncommon for her age. The next morning, Dorsa pleads that she will sleep with her mother next time, which Shida rejects because the young girl is old enough to sleep on her own. For this, Dorsa reveals the true source of her frights of fancy, the jinn.
Jinn, or in English, genies, are something you wouldn't want to wish for. In Islamic mythology, they're spirits that roam the earth, influencing mere mortals to their bidding. Usually, these entities bear bad omens, and given these beings are cautioned by the Quran itself, they're a force to be reckoned with. However, Shida, a liberal woman of science, is skeptical of their existence.
Dorsa also says that the tales of the jinn were whispered to her by Mehdi, the Ebrahimi's nephew. Shida then heads over to the Ebrahimis and is greeted by Mrs. Ebrahimi herself, telling the landlady for her nephew to quit telling her little girl his silly, scary stories. However, the landlady's expression darkens, telling the concerned mother that her nephew is mute. The young boy hasn't spoken a word since his parents died. When Mrs. Abrahimi asks what the stories are being told, she even becomes more serious, especially by how Shida strongly discards the topic. Being a devout Muslim, the landlady can't help but feel sorry for Shida's poor faith. She does admit that Mehdi is creepy but never admits to the boy being wrong. Afterward, Dorsa gets prohibited from playing with Mehdi and the other children residing in the apartment complex by Shida's complaints. Shida sets herself aside to play tea time with Dorsa and Camilla to compensate. During tea time, a telephone rings, which Shida hurriedly answers. As she waits on the receiving end, she hears Iraj speak. Her husband insists on his earlier suggestion while also relaying intelligence from the front that the rumors of Tehran being threatened by bombardment are no longer rumors. As Shida tries to continue listening to what he has to say, Dorsa waves Camilla over her face, telling him that tea time isn't over. Tea time is, in fact, over as Shida becomes anxious about her daughter's playfulness. She begins yelling at her, forcing the poor girl to tremble underneath a bed to hide. Once more, air raid sirens begin blaring. This time it comes with blasts and explosions from Iraqi artillery, proving Iraj correct regarding his call. Most tenants descend into the basement except for one woman tending to her father. Shida tries to bring herself and Dorsa down with the rest, but the woman begs Shida to help her out. Forced to accept the call of duty, they head over to where the woman's old man had collapsed, next to an Iraqi missile sticking out through the roof. Thankfully, it's faulty, so Shida wastes no time reviving the old man to no avail. Despite what she learned in her studies, she still couldn't save him. Yet the dead old man's daughter, much to Shida's objection, suggests that it wasn't the shock of the bombardment that killed him. Dorsa then asks to help find Camilla, who recently went missing, as the young girl also reveals to Shida that she sees Djinn, which she again discards. Suddenly, Dorsa spikes a fever, and despite all conventional treatments, the girl doesn't get better. Shida begins to exercise more to overcome her feelings of inadequacy from not just being a doctor and perhaps being a bad mother as well. To deal with her daughter's frustrating night terrors and her persistent fever, she consults with Mrs. Ibrahimi for advice, only to be once again told that her daughter's being haunted by Djinn. The landlady also warns the ever-so-skeptical mother that if ever the Djinn has taken a prized possession, it's marked you as the victim of choice.
Still doubtful, she asks Mrs. Fakour for a book revolving around the topic of her intended myths of interest just before the old woman is about to leave for her son in Paris. Having found the book she needs to study these entities, Mrs. Fakour reminds Shida that the book intends to lay out the studies of human societies and does not hold answers towards the supernatural, though she herself holds these beliefs just as superstitious, while simultaneously cautioning Shida that belief overthrows reason.
Dorsa's fever persists, so Shida has to take her to another medical practitioner since her husband is yet to be around. Even though she's conducted the correct bedside manner towards her child, the physician considers Dorsa's condition to be psychological rather than an infection. The mental strain because of the war is his diagnosis, though Shida takes the Djinn's hauntings out of his differential. As she drives home on the way, she sees Mehdi standing on the road. Picking him up and driving themselves back to the apartment complex, Shida pauses when she hears the supposedly mute boy demanding to know where Dorsa's doll is. Upon arrival, Shida finds that the tenants and the Ibrahimis are evacuating. Bringing over the boy to his relatives, Shida waves them goodbye as she opts to remain with her daughter in the building despite the threat of bombardment.
They aren't staying behind too long, so Shida begins packing too. But Dorsa insists that Camilla must be found or she wouldn't get better, much to Shida's frustration and annoyance. The child then makes an ultimatum, stating that if her mother truly loves her, she'll find the doll, and that they can only leave then. Shida searches every nook and cranny of their apartment complex in search of the doll as a promise to her daughter, leaving no stones unturned. But the woman loses herself as she can't find it anywhere.
Worn out while calling it a night with her daughter on her side, Shida hears faint moaning emitting from where seems to be the hallway. After getting out of bed to assist the situation, she instead finds an apparition of the old man she failed to save, retreating into a crack in the ceiling. She also hears Dorsa talking to someone. As she runs towards where she is horrified after seeing that the girl is talking to nobody. But this nobody is the Djinn, persuading Dorsa that it knows where Camilla is. Unwilling to be fooled by the trickery of this entity, Shida drags Dorsa out of the apartment and into the city. Panting on the streets, they are caught by curfew regulators who arrest them on religious grounds. being vouched by one of her colleagues to lighten her sentence as she's forced to wear her hijab while being confronted by a Muslim elder condemning her for her criminal offense. Sheeta begins to lose herself even further in the madness of her life. Returning home and reminded about her promise, she continues her search for the doll until another phone call from Iraj. Their phone call goes on normally until what seems to be the voice of Iraj begins to insult Sheeta unwaveringly for being a bad mother to her child. The Djinn then depicts itself as a cloaked figure, which she's seen from her nightmare the night prior, dashing towards where Dorsa is, locking Sheeta behind as it once again begins its act of terror. Forcing the door open, Sheeta finds her daughter having talked to the Djinn. Dorsa is then fully convinced that following it would lead to where Camilla is, though her daughter insists that the entity isn't real. Dorsa calls her out, stating Sheeta wouldn't have to run towards her if it wasn't. Continuing the search for Camilla while opening the drawer where she keeps her psychology book, a decapitated Camilla is in its place instead, angering Dorsa as she tackles her own mother for supposedly beheading the doll. To reconcile with her little girl, Sheeta tapes Camilla's head back in place, fulfilling her promise to Dorsa. With Camilla sort of intact, they prepare to leave the apartment, but as they descend downstairs, Sheeta hears what appears to be Dorsa screaming upstairs, making her conclude that the girl she's accompanying is an apparition. Running upwards to where she's hearing the screaming, she is smacked by her foolishness once she realizes that the screaming child is, in fact, the apparition. Upon realizing that she left her actual child behind, she rushes back down to find that Dorsa is being held captive by the Djinn's seemingly endless cloak surrounding the basement. Within the maze of patterned fabric, Sheeta finds Dorsa out of it, but is immediately suspended by a thick sludge latching onto her feet. Her daughter reaches out to her from the stairwell railing, grabbing tight and pulling hard before the sludge takes full hold of her. Pulling her mother up, the two of them begin to sprint upstairs, but the tape holding Camilla's head fails, letting it fall onto one of the steps. Darting from her car, Sheeta steps on the gas, barging open the garage doors as both narrowly escape the Djinn's wrath and continue drifting away from the apartment as far as possible. For once, Sheeta feels relieved from the threats of war and the supernatural, but it's far from over. Back in the apartment, her prized heirloom, the psychology book, is now in the hands of the Djinn. The daughter was first, now the mother's next. The Djinn always seems to be one step ahead.
This film depicts fear and anxiety with a war setting as the scene. The supernatural elements are an addition to the psychological horror one would experience under the threat of real warfare, especially in a lengthy and brutal one, and the ongoing coping mechanisms conducted to alleviate the shell shock were incurred by it. It also depicts the necessity of female representation, especially in Islamic countries where women are oppressed by the customs they have no choice but to adhere to. While also discussing a woman's femininity, she struggles with it and how she overcomes them, which is brilliantly displayed by this film. Overall, the overlapping themes of this film make for a great cinematic combo. Please subscribe to our channel to be notified when we upload. Also, be sure to let us know what movies we should recap next in the comments down below.